Please be seated. The reign of God is like a dragnet cast to the sea, that gathering every kind. The net that Jesus describes in the parable is quite different from a regular net that was used by the fishermen to catch schools of fish. It's a large net pulled behind a boat or between boats, collecting every kind in its paths. The Greek New Testament does not refer to fish. Most translation did that. But it says in the Greek, it's gathering every kind. Once the dragnet has gathered everything, people will bring it to the shore to sort through the catch. This is the task, not the task of the people later. This is not part of the dragnet's function, but occurs later. Jesus' parable postpones the judgment to the later day, the judgment day, which is similar to the rabbinic tradition. There will be an end of age when God's agents sort the dragnet and determine who will be in and out. But for those seeking justice, those who gathered around Jesus by the Sea of Galilee, those who followed Jesus, left their nets to become his disciples, they may feel anxious and question, where is justice? Where is God's reign here and now in this place? Those of us who still continue this tradition, upholding and uplifting this tradition, continue reading, preaching, sharing the gospel, may feel the same challenge of hearing about the postponement of the judgment to a later day or to the final day. As we grapple with injustice and hope for the fullness of God's reign here and now, sometimes we misread Jesus' parable, leading our interpretations and practices to ultimately foster a theology of exclusion. This urgency leads us to mishear sorting as gathering, causing us to entangle ourselves in a simplistic or cheap grace where we are only able to see evil in others. And instead of being a dragnet that gathers every kind, like Noah's Ark, that provides space for every kind, we become a hook or a net aiming to catch a school of fish or fish we consider are suitable culturally and in our context. Rather than merely gathering, sorting becomes the center of our being and existence. We assume that discipleship and being in the gospel grant us privileges and rights. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer serves as a historical example of the cost of discipleship. Rather than compromising his faith in the theocracy that sorts and creates a victimized other who needed to be cleansed, eliminated because they are different, Bonhoeffer advocated for the church's call to gather and love for every kind. And instead of aligning and participating in the anti-Semitic strategy, Bonhoeffer defended God's reign and the church's core identity, which includes everyone. Beyond the love of the nation state and patriotism of his time, along with hierarchy, theocracy, and nationalism, Bonhoeffer stood by those who were excluded, affirming that God's reign is for everyone. It's a dragnet. It sinks, gathers, includes every kind. Jesus wanted to make sure that the disciples understood his parable. Have you understood? A subsequent verse indicates that Jesus elaborated on the significance of the parable and all other parables in this chapter by presenting another parable which involves a household master who values both the old and the new. For some scholars, the master of the household or the scribe trained to serve in God's reign treasure both the Torah and the teaching of Jesus, which demonstrates the Torah in God's reign. The psalmist, the psalm we read today in Psalm 119 says, "If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in misery." Younger Luther from Germany, believed that the piety expressed in this psalm was insufficient. The psalm should convey a prophetic meaning related to the life of the church and Jesus, how they derive their significance, which is different from the scribe that Jesus shared in the parable. However, 4 years before his days, older Luther approached this psalm from a different angle. He discovered God's love and grace within God's law. In his Bible, Luther wrote Psalm 119, verse 96, "If your law had not been my delight, I would have perished in my misery." As a scribe of God's reign, older Luther, who equally valued the law and the gospel as instrument of divine grace, influenced Bonhoeffer's understanding of costly discipleship. Luther asserts that God's grace is saving through the Torah and is revealed through the Word in Christ. Luther later acknowledged that both the law and the gospel are equally valuable, as each provides grace through God's own righteousness. Bonhoeffer is a theologian and a pastor shaped by the teaching of older Luther, emphasizing the necessity of gathering as the task of the visible church, where we find ourselves hidden in the invisible church, which represents the righteousness of God. Bonhoeffer, in costly discipleship, articulates that disciples' righteousness remain hidden even from themselves. Our righteousness isn't evident even to us. We recognize our righteousness only through Christ, in fellowship with him. The righteousness concealed in our relationship with Christ allows us to embrace our own lives and the life of the church as a grand net, Noah's ark, rather than as a revealed righteousness that sets criteria to include and exclude others. A radical love for others through the love of Christ that hides shielded by God's righteousness inherently involves a strong resistance to injustice and sin. Christ's love sets the standard for justice, empowering others and casting a broad net of God for calling all for everlasting love. Christianity cannot serve as a cover for judgment and the hateful strategies of fascism, nationalism, racism, or sexism, as many have historically assumed and still align themselves with the oppressors. Instead, figures like Bonhoeffer, along with church mothers and fathers, sisters, brothers, and above all, Christ himself, exemplified a different path. Those who are saved through God's love stand in contradiction to the judging strategy of the empire by the very nature of their worship. They suffer with God and reject the instinct to judge and categorize. This is the lesson we learn from the costly discipleship of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The love of God revealed through Christ's cross allows us to see clearly and compels me and us to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering as we gather, invite and call every kind to God's reign.